Right, and we had that Ziring, Rabbi Dr. Kelson, that is live.
Okay, great. Okay, so let's begin. Expect others to join us soon, but let's start on time. So good morning again. This is the second day of our seminar on AI and the future of work with Rabbi Jonathan Ziering. Yesterday we had a really stimulating dual presentation with Rabbi Ziering and Dr. Lisa Simon. And today and tomorrow we'll turn it over to Rabbi Ziering to continue the conversation. So without further ado, Rabbi Ziering, thank you once again for being with us, and the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Dr. Kelson. I mentioned to Dr. Kelson and Kayla before, I'm borrowing an office right now at a wedding hall because right after this year I'll be Misada Kedushin. So if you happen to hear music in the background, if the band is practicing, then forgive me, but we should be good. So yesterday we began our discussion, and Dr. Simon really presented a little bit of the reality on the ground. What professions are going to be most exposed to AI? Which professions are most likely to be exposed in such a way that it will just change the way that business is run, and will modify or enhance the way jobs are done without replacing human beings, and which professions are exposed in such a way that we will replace. And we noted that there's several questions that have to be asked. One is, what is the theoretical capability of artificial intelligence in any given field? And the second issue is, besides for the theoretical possibility, is which professions are most likely to actually adopt it. And the halachic question we dealt with yesterday was, is there a problem with developing or adopting technologies that will replace human beings and put them out of work, focusing on the halachic issue of yored luminot chavero, or in colloquial terms, hasagat gvul, which are the laws around competition, right, that limit in certain circumstances competition when they drive people out of work. But what we ended with yesterday is that the likelihood is that halachic category cannot forbid development or use or adoption of technologies that fundamentally change the reality on the ground, that make it more efficient, that open up new opportunities, that make things particularly more cost effective, and the like. The entire discussion around competition, halacha, is very limited to where you have two people in a similar geographic space who are opening up the same type of business without introducing significant advantages in terms of quality, price, and definitely not reinventing the market. And therefore, there seems to be no evidence that the laws around competition can forbid or should forbid the creation or adoption of technologies that are fundamentally going to change the world. Now, again, Dr. Simon really outlined how many of the fears around AI may be overblown, because in many instances we're not talking about replacement, we're talking about augmentation. But there definitely are going to be cases in which AI, no less than any other new technology, is going to replace human beings. What she noted was that one of the uniquenesses of AI is that some of the jobs that are most exposed are specifically the higher paying jobs, which in the past weren't as subject to replacement, right? Where in the past, machines can replace sort of monotonous physical jobs. Computerization, and especially artificial intelligence, opens the risk to higher paying jobs involved in programming, data analytics, and the like. And that's why a different sort of part of society is really waking up to the danger of AI to their profession. What I want to deal with today is assuming that the reality is that certain people either will be put out of jobs, or at least employers will be faced with the question of whether or not they should adopt technologies that would put people out of jobs, if they choose to pursue that, are there responsibilities towards workers that will that will modify the way that both employers think about it and society? And I thought that before we get to the halachic stories, I really wanted just to introduce a story. It was a well-known story at the time. It's at this point, over 20 years, but every so often the story is revived, and I think it highlights an intuition that many people have, which is that there are at the very least Torah values in play when we talk about the moves that we make, and when we balance our responsibilities towards workers, especially our workers, when we're dealing with an employer, and pure efficiency and monetary gains on behalf of the company, on behalf of the employer. And that is the story of Aaron Feuerstein, who became known as the mensch of Malden Mills. And I gave you here in source one just an article, an interview by about Feuerstein. So Feuerstein was, as we'll see, he owned a textile company in New England, and at some point his factory burned down, and his response was something that really garnered universal acclaim. And I want to read both his story and his value judgment of why he did what he did, just to get us sort of in the mindset. So the mensch of Malden Mills. For years now, we've been hearing about corporate executives who made fortunes for themselves while driving their companies into bankruptcy, costing employees their jobs and sometimes their life savings. Not so at Malden Mills, the textile company in Lawrence, Massachusetts, that invented the fabric Polartec. The fire that broke out at Malden Mills in the winter of 1995 was the largest fire Massachusetts had seen for a century. No one was killed, but the town was devastated. Malden Mills was one of the few large employers in a town that was already in desperate straits. The only thing that went through my mind, how can I possibly recreate it, says owner Aaron Feuerstein, the third generation of his family to run the mill. I was proud of the family business, and I wanted to keep that alive, and I wanted that to survive. But I also felt the responsibility for all my employees, to take care of them, to give them jobs. He made a decision, one that others in the textile industry found hard to believe. Feuerstein decided to rebuild right there in Lawrence, not to move down south or overseas, as much of the industry had done in search of cheap labor. He also made another shocking decision. For the next 60 days, all employees would be paid their full salaries. I think it was a wise business decision, but that isn't why I did it. I did it because it was the right thing to do, said Feuerstein. Right, so the first thing, the background here is that even before this fire, the textile industry had been faced with many financial challenges, and to that end, many companies had moved out of the north, out of New England, to places where labor was less expensive, either in the South, in the United States, or overseas. And Feuerstein hadn't done that to begin with. But when the factory burnt down, and he was given the insurance payout of $300 million, I believe it was, people assumed that he would either just retire because, considering the challenges that the textile industry was facing at the time, this was a way out with a cash payment, or at least he would take the money, and it was an opportunity to rebuild in a place that was more cost effective. But instead of doing that, he committed and did rebuild. And not only that, it was around this time of year, which means that for his workers, it was the holiday season, and he felt that it was particularly bad for him to not pay them during that time. That they'd be going into the holidays without a job, without income. So instead, he paid their full salary, even when there was no work to be done, and he continued to extend that for a while. In number two, and this is a transcript of an interview with Feuerstein. The story Feuerstein was recently, about a year or two ago, was discussed on David Bashevkin's podcast 1840, and there he has a transcript of the interview. And the interview asked him, to what degree is your faith, your religion, responsible for this idea of the moral business? And Feuerstein said, I think it plays a big role. And then the reporters comment, for guidance, he turns to the Torah, the book of Jewish law, right? Feuerstein says and attributes his decision to invest in rebuilding his factory so that his workers could continue working to his values coming from the Torah. And just one more source on this notion, not from Feuerstein now, but from Rabbi Dr. Usher Meir, who writes many articles on the intersection of business ethics and Torah. And he in one of his questions he notes the following. This is source 3. I have a loyal employee who I'm reluctant to let go, but business is so slow that he's just not earning his keep. Should I let him go or keep him on and endure the loss? So Rabbi Meir answers, I think it is a wonderful credit to our community that the most common worker-related questions that reaches me is not from job seekers who are trying to find out how far they can push the envelope on their resumes, but rather from employers who feel a powerful ethical obligation to keep on employees at all costs, even when it constitutes a hardship for the business. While there are some authorities who rule that an employee has some kind of right or ownership of his job, Rabbi Dr. Aaron Levina, Alev Shalom, of blessed memory, who was my mentor, concludes that normative halacha rules that the employee at will has no legal claim for tenure, while stipulating that the employee at will is entitled to notice. Employment at will means that an employer is allowed to fire a worker at any time for any reason, and even for no reason, but not for illegal or religiously invalid reasons. That is the Choshen Mishpat aspect of the question. And Rabbi Meir notes two things, right? One is that he finds it surprising that, in a good way, that most of the questions that come his way about letting workers go don't come from workers who are trying to get, a rabbi to tell their employer, you can't fire me, but rather from employers who are struggling and really for financial reasons feel like they need to let certain workers go, but they don't want to, right? And they want to know their responsibilities. And he notes that really is a testament to the community, that those who are inspired by Torah, their first inclination in his experience is to assume that they should do everything in their possible to express loyalty to their employees and to protect their jobs. And that, despite the fact that his conclusion, I gave you just the summary, but we'll back this up with sources, is that on a purely legal basis, in terms of monetary law in halacha, he doesn't think that there's any reason why an employer can't just let his workers go. And despite the fact that he doesn't think that formally there's something preventing the employer from saving money and letting an employee go who isn't being effective enough in his job, nevertheless, people come to him because they feel wrong. They feel like that's not the Torah thing to do, and therefore they're asking a halachic question. So what I wanted to do was really start with these two instances of Jewish Torah intuition, maybe, right? We have Feuerstein's intuition that the Torah would want him to invest in rebuilding his company so that his workers will have jobs. And then you have Rabbi Dr. Meir, who says that the people who come to him, that is their intuition as well, right? That they feel like there should be something wrong with letting their employees go. They feel like they have a responsibility to them, even in a case when those employees are not really financially benefiting the company. And that's a fascinating intuition, right? Because I think many people think that people's intuition is the opposite. That the only responsibility of a company, or the main responsibility of a company, is to be successful. And obviously, when it's successful, it can be good to its workers. But if there's a clear tension that the financial well-being of the company is to have less workers, right? Whether that be in the case of Feuerstein to simply not rebuild, right? He didn't choose this. It wasn't like he fired people. It's just that the factory burnt down and he got a payout from the insurance company. A certain business logic would just say, listen, if it doesn't make sense to rebuild, so you shouldn't mistreat your workers, but why do you have a responsibility to rebuild a company in a place, rebuild a factory in a place that's not as cost effective, just because your workers happen to be there, the people who worked in the past there. You don't have to reopen it all. You don't have, and you definitely don't have to reopen here, right, to make the best business decision. But his intuition was that the Torah said that there's more to the story than that. So what I want to do is use sort of that intuition to explore the issue, because as I mentioned yesterday, one of the practical questions I've already gotten when it comes to AI was someone who was hired as a consultant for a company to save costs, right? To make the company more efficient financially. And to that end, he was brought in specifically to see not just where AI can augment employment, but where it could replace employees. And he asked me, is there a problem with that? Right? Is there a problem with that? And yesterday we dealt with the competition side, right? Is there a problem of Yorei Luminot Chavero to destroy someone's job? And we said maybe not, right? Maybe not, right? If you're really introducing something new and that causes people to go out of work, so that's what it is. But are there other values in play when we're thinking about either adopting or not adopting technology, or two, even if we do adopt the technology, are there questions that guide how we deal with the people who've been affected, right? The people whose jobs maybe are not as necessary. Is there halakhic guidance to tell us whether you should let them go once they're not necessary because we replace them with whatever technology, AI being just the newest example? What are the halakhic values in play that can inform both the responsibilities of employers and, more broadly speaking, society at large? So that's the question that I want to deal with today. So we can do this in two ways. We can either, I would like there to be, participation in, yesterday was a bit more frontal because we had two presentations going on. I want this a bit more participatory. We can do that in two ways. We can either have some breakout times if people want to learn Bechabruda, or we can do this as a more conversational sheer. I'm not sure what the best thing is under the circumstance. Kayla, do you have a?
Well, I would say I think conversation might be best for this.
Okay, fine. So we'll go with conversation. So let's open up conversation. What do you think? Right. This is the question. This is the question that I want to pose. So what do people think? Is there right? How do we even frame the question of what responsibilities? Let's start with an employer. An employer might have. Where does it come from? What are its limits? Right? How do we even begin to think about this question? Right? Where are we going to look?
So possibly we have an idea with regards to when we need to give charity to someone. I was thinking that when there's someone that comes from like a richer background, then we have a responsibility to give to maintain when we give them charity, we have a responsibility to maintain the level of life that they experienced prior. So that kind of gives us leeway to what's it called? to show
so
some form of
right, so
responsibility
Morty,
to maintain the lifestyle of people that you are providing service for.
okay, so Morty notes that one potential category is staka, and right, he makes a very specific argument, which is not just staka, because staka we think of generally in terms of poverty, which is not necessarily the case. So obviously, if someone loses their job and they don't have savings, they can be thrust into poverty. But he makes a much more specific argument, which is that the ideal form of staka is what we call de machzorot, that you provide to the poor, not just enough for subsistence, but there's a value. Ideally, now obviously this has to be balanced against the reality that if we did this for everyone, we wouldn't have money for the people who really need it. But the ideal is that we give charity in such a way that it maintains people's previous lifestyle, right? De machzoro, because part of tzedakah is not just monetary, but it's about dignity, right? And if someone is used to a certain lifestyle, going down is painful, even if other people might think that lifestyle is sufficient. Now, tzedakah is definitely a potential category, but I'm going to push you, Morty, for a second, which is is there any reason that may be true, right? So yes, if people are put out of a job and now they were making $50,000 a year, okay, fine. So now an ideal tzedakah would be that they're provided with $50,000 a year. But in order for this to be relevant to our discussion, we need to make two more moves, right? One is that tzedakah should somehow, the fact that there's an obligation of tzedakah should somehow not just express itself in providing money, but should express itself in providing employment, right? Because in order for it to be relevant here, right, we need to make that move. And the second is that if we want this to be relevant, this obligation has to devolve in some way on the employer in a greater way than it does on other people, right? It has to, right? Because that right, if the question here is, should these considerations motivate or animate the way that an employer thinks about it, then we have to ask, are they uniquely placed, right? Because you could say, listen, it's true that Feuerstein was wealthy, but if you know the follow-up story, it happens to be that this was, from a financial perspective, a bad decision, right? This isn't a story with a happy ending. He didn't succeed. He rebuilt, but he ended up going to debt and ended up dying basically impoverished. Right? So the intuition, in order to ground the notion that this was something he'd be obligated to do, you have to say that the obligation's on him more than he was at the time very, very wealthy, but I don't know exactly how wealthy he was, but let's say he was worth tens of millions of dollars, even hundreds of millions of dollars. I don't know exactly. Right? He still is less capable of providing for them than Elon Musk, who every time if you refresh the question of how much he's worth, right, the change by the second is enough to fund the entire company, right? And you'd have to wonder, why should this devolve on him more than Elon Musk, who's worth whatever he's worth today, $430 billion or whatever it was. I looked just for comparison. I'm like, who is the wealthiest person alive? And I did not realize that, his wealth had doubled or tripled. But for this to be something, so to rephrase the question, which is, tzedakah may be the right category, but do we have sources that, one, gives prime of place to tzedakah in a way that expresses itself through employment? Question one. And two is there any language to give prime place of that obligation to the employer, such that type of consideration should animate, right, the decision of someone who wants to know whether to adopt technology that's going to replace his workers. So what do we think, right? Now that we've shot, because I think you're right, stuck is the right place to go, right? But let's push it, right? We need to deepen that. Also, really good to see you, Morty. Always good to see you. So does Morty or anyone else want to push it farther, right? Do we have sources that either tell us that tzedakah is a relevant conversation when we're talking about employment, and two, is there reason to believe that obligation, that value, in any way speaks more to employers, right, than a richer outsider, let's say, or just a rich outsider.
Well, regarding the employer, I mean, you would have to perhaps one avenue would be to sort of analogize the employer to like someone in close relationship and other means, with the poor of one city before the poor of another city, etc. And you'd have to claim that the prior employee relationship, is relevant to the stuck considerations.
Okay, so what Dr. Kelson points out is that now I'm gonna jump on the word analogize, but for the moment, let's assume that you're right, that you have to analogize this to the case of the concentric circles around stuff, right? And you're definitely right? If you look at 12, what Dr. Kelson is referring to is two Gemarot, one in Bava Metzia Ayin Aleph that says Ikedematni lahada Rabuna Aha, Tani Rabbi Yosef im kesef talved ami et ani imach. If you lend money to my nation, to the poor with you, why does it emphasize my nation? To tell you that there are concentric circles, that staka starts, the closer you are to someone, the more intense your staka obligation. Ami v'nachri, ami kodem. Right? My nation and another nation, your nation comes first. Ani v'ashir, obviously rich and poor, ani kodem. Now this comes back to Mordechai's point, right? You would think that lending money, obviously, you would go, which is conceptualized in halacha as a form of tzedakah. It would be obvious that you lend to a poor person before a rich person. But apparently it's not, right? Because there is a notion that even someone who's not necessarily poor, but is in need, right? Because they don't have money for what they need right now, that's also called in the general discussion of tzedakah, right? Which is important here. The poor and poor of your poor, your family and the like, or the poor of your city. So then your poor first. It's your city, another city. So and more explicitly by tzedakah in source 13, you get patoch tiftach ein li elo la'ani ircha. I might have thought that it's only the poor of your city. Lani ir acheret minayin tamad lomar patoch tiftach mikol makom. Right, that it's even a novelty that you even have to give money to people outside of your city at all, because so ingrained is this notion of concentric circles of tzedakah. And I gave you just in 14 because it was easier for me, but I put a quote a little bit from my recent book just to summarize some of the issues. Why is it that we function in tzedakah with these concentric circles? So there are different theories that are given. Some say that this is just pragmatic, right? That people will most effectively give tzedakah to those who are around them. Rabbi David Cohn argues that it's a function of gratitude, right? That in tzedakah, it's not just that you have to help those in need, but you have a special obligation to those who've, have done things for you in the past. And gratitude orients the way we think about our tzedakah and chesed obligations in general. Rav David Aryav just thinks that it's about peace, right? If we treat those around us, closer to us, better, that's important for creating a healthy a society. Rav Shimon Shkop has a unique theory, and he says that it's actually based on the understanding that self-interest always comes first, but the Torah's conception of this is in 14. Someone's asking if they're on the sheet. My summary here is in 14, but you can see all the references there. Rav Shimon Shkop says, right, in ein anili mili, right? If I'm not for myself, so who will be for me? Which tells you that your first obligations are to yourself. But Rav Shimon Shkop argues that the challenge of the Torah is to expand your notion of self, right? To recognize that you are not just yourself, right? The circle around you is also partially you, and that's why you have an obligation to them, right? So Dr. Kelson says, well, maybe we should take sort of these ideas and say, maybe that doesn't just give priority to, your family and your neighbors, but maybe your employees are somehow also part of that inner concentric circle. Okay. Dr. Kelson, do you want to add to that before I move on? Okay.
Enough for now.
What's amazing to me, and I honestly had never really thought about this sources enough, is that it's not just an analogy, but amazingly, this concept seems to be the source, right? We're going to answer our two questions in one shot, right? Because if you go back to number 4, this is a relatively well-known source that the Rambam lists 8 levels to tzedakah, right? He has a hierarchy of charitable giving. And he says, Shmone ma'alot yesh b'tzedakah zu l'mala mizu. There are 8 levels of charity. Ma'ala gdola she'ein l'mala mimena. The highest level is zehamachzik biyad Yisrael shemach v'notin lo matana o hova'a o ze ilo shutafut o mamtzi lo melacha kedei lechazek et yado shelo tzarech l'briot lishol. Right? It says the reason charity is the highest level of charity is not when we're actually dealing with poor people. It's when you're dealing with people who aren't yet poor. Right? That is, and therefore giving them a job or making them your business partner or giving them capital loans that will help them build business, right? So they don't become poor. That's the highest level of tzedakah, right? So first of all, this comes back to Morty's point before, which is we shouldn't be afraid to invoke tzedakah in this conversation because the ideal tzedakah isn't with poor people, it's preventing people from becoming poor, right? So keeping people in their job is, as the Rambam tells you, the paradigm of tzedakah, right? Tzedakah, often has when we think about charity, right, that has like a dirty feel to it. Like, why should let people have their job? That's charity. But the Rambam's saying, no. The highest level of charity, first of all, is not a handout, is making sure that people don't need handouts, right? Which is making sure that they're employed. Okay, but what is the source for that? And this is very, very striking. The source for that notion is as follows. If you look at the Mishnah in 5, the Mishnah says, Yossi ben Yochanan ishu shalayim, Omer yihi beitcha patuach levracha, your house should be open wide to guests and the like, v'yu aniyim b'nei beitecha, and the poor should be part of your home. Now, what does it mean that the poor should be part of your home? So some people just say, like this is the second answer in Rabbi Yonah, that it means that when you bring people in who are poor, you shouldn't just give them a handout, you should make them feel at home. You should try to maintain their dignity, you should, bring them in for a meal and the like. But the majority of Rishonim actually think that that's not what's going on here. That the yuanim b'nei beitecha means that they should be in your employ. That instead of giving charity, you should employ the poor because that's the highest level of tzedakah, right? So if you look at Rabbi Yonah, for example, here in number 6, he says, "Hu nidrash l'shnei panim b'makom shekoneh avadim." Instead of doing what was the norm in the ancient world, which is having slaves or servants, you shouldn't do that. And then you're supporting them. Yishtamesh ba'aniyim, right? You have jobs available on your estate, in your business. Well, then you should hire the people who need jobs, right? They should become members of your household, your business, your estate, whatever it might be. And he said they'll be great. You won't have to give tzedakah because you're accomplishing tzedakah by hiring the people who need jobs, right? That's the highest level of tzedakah, right? So v'yu anim b'nei beitecha is that you should, when faced with the option of who should I hire, you should hire the people who need it, and therefore make them part of your family, your household, right? Not just like invite them for a meal, but no, like there's someone who needs a job, and they have, I don't know, you need a gardener, and someone mildly can figure out how to garden, or maybe he has skills as a gardener, and you have the choice to hire him, so you should. But and the source for this seems to come, right? If you look at 7 and 8, the Rambam formulates this halacha, and it's quoted by the Torah and Shulchan Aruch as well. The Rambam writes in number 7, Sivu chachamim shiu b'nei beito shel adam aniyim v'yitomim b'makom ha'avadim. That your Chachamim say that the members of your household should be the poor, the orphans, instead of hiring outside help. Right? Mutav lo lishtamesh be'ilu v'yanu b'nei Avraham Yitzchak v'Yaakov b'nei Chasad. It's better to hire these people so that these Jewish poor should benefit from your property. Not, he's talking about Avadim, so it's going to be people from Canaan, classically. He has other concerns here. But if you have the anim as part of your house, you're constantly going to be getting mitzvot. Now, there are other explanations of this, but the source for this seems to be the Gemara in Bava Metzia in number 8, where the Gemara says, Pirchos de Adam Maihi. What is the adornment of a person? Kiha. There was an elderly slave who went out and he dyed his head and beard black, so he would look younger and he would get hired. Right? So he told Rava, acquire me as a slave, right? I'm a young, strong slave. Amarle, no, the poor should be a member of your household. So I'm not going to hire you when there are poor people who need a job, and I can hire them. Right? And then it tells the story of someone who didn't listen to this advice. He did acquire this slave, and then he said, can you get me water? The guy went to get water, and magically his black beard became white, right? Because the water got in his beard, and he realized that he made a mistake. Wow, you are older than my father. Now there are other explanations of this morale, but what I want to focus on, and this is what some modern authorities have focused on, which is what is the right? This, according to the Rambam, and the Gemara seemingly, is the source for the fact that a level of tzedakah, maybe even the highest level of tzedakah, is to hire those people who need your job. Now, this is an anticipatory claim that someone who needs tzedakah, the best thing you can do is give them a job, right? Except what's the framing, right? Once you give them a job, what are they referred to in relation to you, right? How are they now described?
Right? Part of you, part of your household,
right? The part of your family, b'nei beitecha, right? B'nei beitecha, right? So while the framing of the Mishnah and the Gemara is anticipatory, meaning when you're choosing who to employ, ideally it should be the people to whom you have tzedakah obligations, because the highest level of tzedakah is to make sure people don't need charitable handouts. Right? There is a very strong implication of post facto. Once you've done this, once you've hired them, right, we describe your employees as b'nei beitecha, right, the members of your household, which once, as Dr. Kelson noted, the Talmud says that the number one rule in tzedakah is the concentric circles, right, that the people who are closer to you, you have more responsibility to. And we call, right, we refer to the entire notion that you should express your tzedakah obligations by employing people and making them part of your home, right? Making them part of your household. We now have to ask, is there the concomitant post facto implications that once I hired them and now they're b'nei beitecha or b'nei beiti, and now it's a question of figuring out, do I owe them something on the level of tzedakah to keep them in my employ? We now have a reason to believe yes, because the Torah has described them as beitecha, as part of your innermost concentric circle, right? That your employees are part of your buy-in. In a wild tshuva, before I get to that tshuva,
sorry, Ziring, can I just note that I just was thinking that you're saying, what you're saying, this is very interesting. And you're right, I thought about it more as an analogy. I had never thought about this mission the way you're describing it. But Avadim, to the contrary, we know that the Gemara has sort of conversations to the extent to which which workers are related to Avadim. Avadim as members of one's bayit, that's more sort of well-known, or, at the time, more well-established relationship. So I'm thinking about it now. I never thought of Mishnah that way, and I never thought about it quite this way, but maybe it's not as mechudash, a notion as we might think, as long as we're willing to go from Evet to Poel.
Right. But the interesting thing is, right, it's not saying to make the aniyim your avadim. It's to not hire avadim, right? Or not acquire avadim, right?
Right.
And instead hire workers, right?
Right.
You're right that in Evet
right.
being a ben bayit has other
Right.
halachic implications, like by a kohen, right? That the Evet of the kohen is enough part of his household that he can eat truma, which shows a very direct correlation. And that's obviously not fully true for a worker, right? If a kohen hires a poor person to be, to work in his house, and he's, obviously he can't eat truma, right? So yes, there is something intense about the avdut relationship. But the fact that we in any way compare the poel, right, the worker that you're hiring, to be a ben bayit in that way, right, is telling. Now, again, are there some who read this Mishnah differently? Yes, right. As I mentioned, some think this is just, make the poor feel at home. But the simple read of the Gemara here in Bava Metzia is that this is the source, either literally or at least as a secondary read, for the intense value of expressing charitable obligation through employment. Now, again, there are some who just say that this is really about an opposition to hiring slaves, or Rabbi Raphael Ziring, in his most recent book, reads this passage somewhat creatively, that it's in opposition to slavery in general, right? That you should opt to avoid slavery and instead move to employment, which has, obviously is a more dignified model to begin with. Some see this as just a preference for Jewish work over non-Jewish work, part of this sort of those concentric circles. But again, what's hard to escape at some level is that however we got here, by the time we employ them, the phrasing is that they become a ben bayit. And while the context in the Mishnah is anticipatory, right, the reality is now they are bnei bayit. Right now, the important thing that I just gave you here from Avram Avidan is, and this again, I repeat this just to highlight the fact that we shouldn't run away from the charitable category. The fact that this is the paradigm of tshuva highlights that tzedakah highlights that tzedakah is not just about the poor, right? We shouldn't run away from this category on the assumption that that tzedakah is something as a handout. That's not what this is, right? It's that the highest level of tzedakah refers to people who are not yet poor, right? The people who are in the danger of becoming poor, and you can stop that by maintaining their dignity and giving them a job, right? And that's a very important framing here, because that's what makes it that we can invoke the tzedakah category without denying the dignity of these people. Because I think people would be insulted if you said, "Oh, you're keeping me on as a charitable donation." That's true, right? If that's what tzedakah meant, right? But it's not that it's a handout. It's just that the highest level of tzedakah is to prevent people from entering into that situation. Now, this was taken to a radical extreme by Rav Shlomo Ishon, and I gave you the entire tshuva in number 16, because I'm not sure that people would believe me if I didn't put the whole tshuva. We're not going to read the whole tshuva, but it is a wild tshuva. Oh yeah, Nathan.
Is it Rambam Matnat Aniyim 10:7 where it says not yet poor? Because I don't think I've ever read it that way.
It's
oh, never mind. I see it at the end.
It's 10, right? Yes, exactly. Right. Ad shelo yipol v'yitztareh, right? That you should give them tzedakah before they fall into the category of poor.
Okay, I see it now. Thank you.
Yeah, and it's when you connect 10:7 with 10:17, right, that you get this particular construal. But Rav Shlomo Ishon, well, okay, you know what? First, let me look at Rabbi Dr. Mayer's, because he gives like a nice summary of the type of argument that you can make in this direction. And then I want to at least introduce you to Rav Ishon, because Rav Ishon is a much more radical application of this than I ever would have thought of. And even if we don't accept him to the end, it's worth realizing how far people take this when we're trying to figure out how relevant this is to the conversation. So if you look at 15, Rabbi Dr. Meir says as follows: giving a job to a needy person is considered a fulfillment of the mitzvah of tzedakah. If you have a worker who is not worth his keep, but who may have difficulty finding a decent job elsewhere, there are many reasons to maintain that keeping him on should be very high on the tzedakah priority ladder. Giving tzedakah through employment is the highest form of charity. The highest level of charity of all is to steady the hand of the Israelite who falters, give him a gift or a loan, or make a partnership or offer him work in order to strengthen his hand so that he shouldn't have to ask. Rambam Madoniyim 10:7. In this way, the employee maintains his self-image and standing in the community. Next point, your worker should be high on the list of charity recipients. The Torah commands us to give a gemilat chesed loan to the poor of your city. Chazal learned from this a concentric circle of preferred charity recipients. A member of your nation and an alien. Your nation comes first. A poor person and a rich person, the poor person is precedence. A poor relative and the poor of your town, the poor relative is precedence. The poor of your town and the poor of a different town, the poor of your town have precedence. A person whom you have worked closely with over a long period of time should be considered the poor of your town, and other things being equal, should be higher on the priority list than an anonymous stranger who is receiving tzedakah through a donation to an organization. This is a very cost-effective form of charity. While your contribution or sacrifice is only the difference between what the worker is worth and what he gets paid, which is probably only a fraction of his salary, his benefit may be the entire amount of his pay, depending on job market conditions. So you might get more bang for the buck in this way. Of course, this does not mean firing workers is always a problem. Sometimes workers are not only unproductive, but counterproductive. In this case, hiring may be not such a cost-effective way of giving after all. Furthermore, if it's obvious the worker is unnecessary, then keeping him on may not achieve the goal of not shaming him. If business is weak, the employer may himself not be making enough money to be giving charity generously. But if you're considering discharging a worker who will have a difficult time finding another job, then it is worth asking yourself if keeping him him or her on until the job market improves may not be the best fulfillment of your charity obligation. So Rabbi Meir has what I think is a reasonable formulation of what would emerge from this, which is, obviously, this can't tell you can never fire somebody, right? If if you can't afford to keep them on, then this is not a discussion. You come first, right? If your business is going to fail because you keep everybody on, so that's not what we're talking about. We may not even be talking about a case where you can afford it, but it's very clear that the person can't do their job anymore. Because then you have to wonder, is this better than charity, right? Are you returning their dignity, maintaining their dignity, or is that a worse handout, right? You call someone, we're keeping you on at your full salary because you are a manager, but what we want you to do is sit in a room and do tic-tac-toe, right? Like that may be worse, right, than just a straight handout or a pension, I don't know, or whatever you want to kind of come up with. But it is relevant in the following way, which is, again, as Lisa talked about yesterday, often we're talking about, we're not talking about, we're talking about marginal benefits. Let's say you have, if you introduced a technology, then theoretically you could do the job of 5 people with 3 people, right? Now, you have a few options in front of you. You could do the job of 5 people with 3 people, and let's say those workers each made $50,000 a year, right? So now what you essentially have is the opportunity to save $100,000, okay? Let's say you are someone who makes $1 million a year, so just in straight maaser, your tithe would be $100,000. So you have $100,000 in play, right, in your basic tzedakah obligations, right? So now, do you let go of 2 employees because you don't technically need them. Take that $100,000 and give it to the, I don't know, the school of your choice, to Tomchei Shabbos, to fund the poor, the poor in, locally. Or do you say, listen, I will either not adopt the technology at all, and keep on my 5 workers, and I will maybe even count the $100,000 that I could have saved. This is my charity. I won't tell them that, right? Or maybe I will adopt the technology, setting the groundwork for more effectiveness when the employees, retire of their own accord. But in the meantime, so we're not running at maximum rate. We're not running at, with the minimum number of workers that we could technically get away with, right? But no, that's not necessarily obvious to everybody, right? You've adopted technology that set the groundwork for needing less workers in the future. But in the meantime, you're not going to let people go. Should part of your consideration of whether you save your $100,000 by letting go of these 2 workers, and then take that $100,000 and give it to, Tomchei Shabbat or whatever, should you do that, or should you say, my obligations are to my workers first? So let me either not adopt the technology or not jump to, use the technology to whittle down my employees to the absolute minimum. I remember when I was growing up, the rabbi in one of the shuls in Staten Island, there was a barber in the Frum community who had a who he was he was from, and he charged more than, let's say, like the barbers in the mall, like the supercuts, right? But because he charged more, so obviously, some people just wanted to save the few dollars and go to supercuts in the mall. And one of the rabbis said, listen, it's very clear to him that going to this person is a fulfillment of tzedakah. And if people really couldn't afford the extra $5 for the haircut, so then they should take that $5 from, in their head, not tell the guy, but in their head, right? This is their tzedakah money, right? You have money for $10 for a haircut, and you have a, whatever, today you have a $10 budget for tzedakah. So the $10 for your haircut budget, that's the 10. The extra 5 that you're taking to go to the person who needs the work, right, is tzedakah in this broader sense of giving employment, right? And if that's what you need to do, so then consider your tzedakah. What Rabbi Meir is saying is some version of that, which is not that you can never let people go, but if by letting people go, you're going to have, you're going to open up access theoretically to an extra $100,000, that what are you going to do? You're going to redirect it to, to people in need. Well, the 2 people that you let go, who this is their only source of income, they are also going to be people in need, and they're b'nei beitcha, right? So maybe you should take this, the broader ethos of tzedakah should inform you as you decide, what technologies you adopt, and what technologies, even if adopted, you allow to whittle down your employees to the absolute bare minimum, right? Now, that broad framing, I think, is at least reasonable, right? That the ethos of tzedakah should make that part of your calculus. I think that's reasonable, because Rabbi Meir doesn't give you specifics, right? He doesn't tell you what a company can afford, what they can't afford, at what point it becomes a joke, right? And the person's going to lose his dignity. It's just pointless, right? He just tells you that as part of your thought process of what should be adopted, and how minimalist of a, how minimalist you should be in terms of your employees, you should remember that, saving $100,000 on your employees, which you're then going to give to charity anyways, maybe the reality that you owe something morally and religiously to these workers should make you be less cutthroat in your business, right? And incorporate those values into your business. Now, this is very easy if we're talking about, let's say, a one-man business, right? Because then you can say your responsibilities are for, your responsibilities aren't to your investors, they're not to your partners, they're to you, right? Rabbi Meir works very well for something like that, right? Which is, a guy who is used to having $1 million, income, $100,000 stuck a budget, and now he's debating whether he should, cut $100,000 out of the budget in his business, right? And then use that to give to his charity of choice, or should he allow his business to function not maximally, right? But still, reasonably, and count his, check off his stucca in his head that these two workers are now, his, are now provided for. Obviously, this gets much more complicated when you are not the owner of the business, you're a manager, right? It's not necessarily your money to play with, or you are you own a company which is publicly traded, and therefore you have responsibility to, right, investors, and your job may not be to may not be to play the charitable generous person from the company, right? That may be the case, but at least the fact that this model exists is reasonable, right? It's a consideration that we should have as part of the conversation. Where this gets a little bit crazy in its implications is when you take a few jumps, or again, every jump that we're about to make can be justified, but when you combine all the jumps together, the conclusion is very radical. Maybe crazy is not the word, but it's definitely radical. Okay, I gave you the full tshuva, like I said, by Shlomo Isham, who's the head of the Keter Institute, which is an institution that is devoted to basically examining economic issues from a halachic vantage point. And he was asked, I found in another article by Rabbi Yammer from Shalabim, that this was originally a case from Teva, I believe. But basically, Teva was trying to figure out whether it should close down a factory. That was basically, right, to either hire less people or to outsource it. So that's what he was asked. He said, he said, listen, everyone agrees that if a business will collapse, if you don't let people go, you can let people go. That's not a question. דיוננו נסב על מצבים שבהם תוכל החברה להמשיך לקיים להיות מבוססת מבחינה כלכלית גם בלא פיטורים. We're talking about a case where the business can survive even without letting people go. אלא שהיא מעוניינת בפיטורים לשם הגדלת רווחיה. But it wants to let people go to maximize profit. עוד נדגיש שאיננו עוסקים במערכת זה בכלול שאלות הלכתיות או השפטיות נגד לפיטורי עבדים כשהם נעשים תוך הפרת חוזה העבודה. We're not talking about breaking contract, that's a different halachic issue. המאמר עוסק רק בהיבט של מצוות הצדקה שפיטורי עובדים. We're just talking about the tzedakah component of the question of letting people go. ובשאלה אם רשאית חברה להפסיק העסקתם של עובדים. Can a company end people's employment? ובאילו התנאים היא יכולה לעשות כן לאור הלכות הצדקה. Okay, that's his question. Now again, I gave you the whole tshuva, and then just to show you, since this is our topic, which is AI. I gave you translation in 17 of a translation, some key points from ChatGPT, at least some of them, and I let ChatGPT do the work. I have no problem outsourcing translation to ChatGPT. I am more than happy to give that over to ChatGPT. B'simcha, they can have that. If I was a professional translator, I might not say that. I'm not, and I would rather teach than spend the time translating. So. B'simcha. But his argument goes like this, okay? His first point is, first thing is, letting people go unfairly might even be theft. Okay, right? So first of all, he ups the ante. He says it's not just lack of tzedakah. Firing people who are not going to have not be able to support themselves might be theft. And again, if you look in, if you just jump in his article to footnote 1. This is on page 8. I gave you, I inserted some key translations. He puts all the sources in his footnotes, so I put some key translations. And this is based on a Midrash Tanchuma. V'chiyesh adam gozel dalim. The pasuk in Mishlei says that someone steals the poor, and it says, "Who steals from the poor?" Mal goes udal. Who steals from the poor? Now that's not the best person to steal from. You should steal from the rich. They have money. So the Midrash says, no, it's where you don't provide him with a job. Right? He was used to having a job, and you take away his job. That's the theft of the poor. Right? So the first thing Rabbi Shon does is that this isn't just charity. This is potential theft. Move 1. On the flip side, giving someone a job that prevents him from being poor is the highest level of tzedakah. That's well established. Point 3. Mikan shemitzvat tzedakah mechayevet lid'og lo rak lemi shekvar hagiel matzav shalomni ela ach lemi shalul hagiel matzav kazeh. Point 3. From here, you learn that tzedakah tells you not only that you provide for the poor, but that you prevent people from becoming poor. Im yovad makom avodato af shekarega eno anikla. V'emshech hasakato shel adam ba'avodato mikayem evo masik mitzvat tzedakah menochar. By keeping him employed, that's the highest level of tzedakah. Point 4. Amnam ba'alei amaniyot shel chaver v'anyanin b'kama sheter v'chem hashkatam. Right. So now he says, well, you'll tell me that's great for an individual, but what about a publicly traded company? What about the shareholders? So now Rabbi Shon starts to say things that are more mekudas, and he says, okay, but mutelet achrayut al miniat pigya b'makom zam shel avdim. They're also obligated halachically and morally in the well-being of the employees, right? Because they're also the employers, right? Okay, so therefore I can push it to them. Now that's less obvious already, right? Because while the one-man show, right, the one-man show who has $1 million and $100,000 a year in tzedakah that he can give, and using that to keep people in his employ, that's one thing. But maybe the people who have stock in this company are themselves living hand to mouth, right? And the income they get from their stocks is what allows them to pay the bills at the end of the month. And by minimizing their profits, they don't have enough money, right? Now, that's not obvious anymore because right, people have the right to prioritize themselves, right? So things are getting more complicated, but he ignores that complexity. Al-Kain, but he says, because of this, mutar lana chevra lishkol derevdim lo rak lo oram hashtuba kalkali shela piturim avor chevra. But once he's asserted that there is an ethical halachic obligation of stockholders to consider the tzedakah obligations, well then the management of the company, even though they don't own it, have the right to take such considerations into account. And he says legally, at least in Israel, you are allowed to take such considerations. You're not obligated legally to maximize profits at the expense of your workers. So he says legally this is a given in Israel. Okay, he's made a few moves here that are radical, that are at least novel, which is that these obligations devolve on not just individual owners of company, but both stock owners and management. And therefore, these considerations should be taken into account by them as well. That's a little bit novel, but okay, not yet a huge jump practically. The huge jump he makes is the next one, which is that there's another rule in tzedakah that makes tzedakah a little bit scary, which is that under certain circumstances, tzedakah is not just an obligation, but it is an obligation that can be coerced, right? That can be coerced. And what Rabbi Shon does next is argue that this obligation of prioritization in the concentric circles, and the notion that your employees are in your inner concentric circles, and that obligation devolves not just on a single company, on a single owner, a company with one owner, but on a publicly traded company and on management, He then says, not only is this a value to take into consideration, but it's one that you are obligated to, and the law should force you to take into consideration and forbid you from firing your employees, assuming you can afford it. How does he get to that conclusion? Well, he says as follows: Al pi halacha kofim al tzedakah. The halacha is that you are allowed to coerce people to fulfill tzedakah. That's what it says in Shulchan Aruch. Right? If someone gives too little, so the first thing to note is there are cases in which you can coerce on tzedakah. However, right, when the case in Shulchan Aruch, when can you coerce on tzedakah? If someone's not giving enough. But that's not what we're talking about. We're not talking about not giving enough. We're talking about who do you give to? Right? The question is not how much you give, but who are you giving to? So he needs to make the next move, which is that the laws of coercion don't just allow us to force people to give the right amount of tzedakah, but they allow us to force someone to give to the right person. Where does he get a notion like that? So he says, "Kfiyat zu ena mugbelet la'asirit or l'chomesh min hasem shalom." It's not just the 10th or 20th, of the 10th or a 5th, rather 10 or 20% of that people give for tzedakah. Gabai tzedakah Rashaim lichbot nitinat skumim gdolim yoter l'tzedakah. They can coerce even more. If that's what the poor need. If the poor need it and you can afford it, then you can be forced to do it. And then he quotes a passage in Batra that Rabbi was compelled Rav Natan to give 400 dinar, which is a lot of amount, but he could afford it, to tzedakah. Okay. Why can you do this? Right? Why can you do this? So here he introduces the Chacham Tzvi. And the Chacham Tzvi says, the top of page 7, the reason is because the fundamental insight of tzedakah is that it doesn't just stem from the religious obligations of the giver, but from the need of the one getting it. That creates a religious and actually monetarily enforceable debt. And that's why you could take it even from Yitomim and the like. Okay. If you skip down a little bit, he says that this obligation isn't just on individuals, but it's even on a company, right? Why? So here he invokes the Rambam, right? He says because it devolves on the employer because they're b'nei beitcha. They're in your inner concentric circle. And 2 is you'll tell me, okay, but maybe they are my inner concentric circle. But maybe, why do I have to express that by keeping them my employee? He says, well, because that's the highest level of tzedakah, right? They are in your inner concentric circle, and this is the highest level of tzedakah. So it's the highest level of tzedakah with the people to whom you owe the most. So add to that the fact that tzedakah creates a enforceable debt and can be coerced, so you should be able to coerce this. Now, the problem, he notes, is that the entire notion of coercing for tzedakah is not obvious, right? The Gemara does say it, but on the other hand, the Gemara elsewhere says that in general, you're not allowed to coerce people to perform mitzvot where the reward, right, where matan stara b'tzidah, where the reward is mentioned in the Torah. Now, tzedakah, you are promised reward if you give charity. So that should be, right, that should break the rules. This should be something that isn't coercible. So here there are several answers. I'm not going to read them all inside, but you can look, and this is section Gimel on page 7. I mean, he notes there are different theories that are out there. One, is that we don't actually force people. We force people to want to give. Okay, this is a classic halachic move, right? We don't coerce them. We pressure them into saying that they want to do it. Okay. A second aspect is the Radbaz. That the Radbaz says, as the Chacham Tzvi does, that tzedakah is different. It's not a regular mitzvah. It's a mitzvah that implies a monetary obligation. And it's that debt component that triggers this coercion. Now, he says, well, why does this matter? Why does it matter whether the reason you're allowed to coerce is because it's an exception to the rule that you're allowed to coerce on mitzvot, right? Or because there is a debt that's created, right? And what you're really coercing is the fulfillment of a debt. He said there's a big difference because companies are not necessarily halachically treated as human beings with mitzvah obligations. Right? If it's about a mitzvah, so then maybe you can't coerce a corporation. But if, on the other hand, it is a charity implies a debt, so then maybe even without a human being, right? You're dealing with a company, which is, amorphous halachically, you could still coerce it. Now, based on all of these and other things, right, there's a very complicated discussion if you want to look in his footnotes where part of his proof is that we coerce people. In the time of the Gemara, most people most people started working as young kids, and therefore the Gemara assumes that you only really have to support your children from age until age 6, and after that you don't have to. And the Gemara then conceptualizes supporting your children as tzedakah, but we force people who don't want to support their young kids to support them. And he notes that part of the question of what's going on there is relevant here, whether you're being coerced because of tzedakah or because of a unique obligation in Chazal to support your children. But basically, with a lot of, he takes the most extreme conclusion you could at every stage of this argument, which is that tzedakah can be coerced. That coercion is because of a debt. The debt isn't just on amount, but it's also on the address, the proper address for tzedakah. Because it's about a debt, that can be imposed even on a corporation, which might not have technical mitzvah obligations. And therefore, his conclusion is sikul. A company, if it's going to go under without firing people, then they can let people go. But two, when you're not dealing with the continued existence of the company, the company is obligated to keep them employed with dignity. And you have two options: keep them employed or find them another job or give them enough of a pension that they can support them, beyond the legal obligations. And three is the great amount of wealth that companies have must be pushed to tzedakah, whether that's the outside or inside to their workers, as long as it doesn't destroy the attractiveness financially of the company. So Rabbi Shon, and again, you can read his whole truth. I gave it to you so you can follow every one of his arguments. Takes what I think is probably the most radical version of this, which is again, the view on Yim B'nei Beitecha tells you that 1, employment is a form of tzedakah. 2, that you have a special obligation to your employee. 3, tzedakah is something that can be coerced. 4, the coercion of tzedakah applies not just to how much you give, but to whom you give, and follows the concentric circles in halacha. 5, tzedakah is unique because it's not just a mitzvah, but it creates a debt, and therefore you can impose obligations of tzedakah even on corporations that don't necessarily have mitzvah obligations, which leads him to 6, that corporations should be coerced to keep on employees, or at least to find them other jobs, even if it's not in the best financial interest of the company, as long as the company can basically remain solvent and at least successful. And therefore, we should legally enforce this prioritization. Right? That's his conclusion. Right? Which obviously, if you take it to the case of AI, it would mean that if you take this seriously, you should have the government going around, the religious government, whatever, or a religiously inspired government should go around to companies who want to adopt AI in a way that makes them lay off workers and say, well, will you be solvent if you leave these workers on? Will you be successful? You will. Well, then you can't fire them forever. Right? I don't know. Right? He doesn't put a time limit on this, forever. Right? But that's essentially what his thesis is, right? It takes the most maximalist view on every stage of this argument, but that's the conclusion he comes to. So what do you say, right? Do we? My inclination, is that Rabbi Meir's softer formulation, which is the fact that employment of those who've already been employed is a stock of value, should inform the conversation, right? That I think is a given. What do people think of Rev Ishon's expansion of this, which is we should mandate this in the most maximalist way that we can, right? Coerce people. Yeah, Deborah.
So I'm kind of concerned that what's going to happen here is what happened with unionization to some of the bigger corporations in the United States, where when the obligations became untenable, competitors came in from the outside who didn't already have those obligations and were able to, smash the original companies to smithereens because they could operate without prior obligations.
Good. So Deborah brings up what Lisa said yesterday, which is you always have to remember, right? Rabbi Shon is very narrow here. It's, can your company survive right now? But as she noted, the real danger to employees is not necessarily their employer letting them go. It's that a company that chooses to not do this, look, maybe right now you can still continue your company by not adopting these technologies or not letting people go. But if another company emerges that is basically completely run, right, by AI, and can do what you can do with 100 workers, with 5 workers, and can therefore offer things at a third the price while still making a healthy margin, then they're just going to emerge overnight, and your company is just going to go bankrupt, right? You're going to be, and at that point, if your basic argument is I can't adopt technologies or manifest the implications of those technologies until the point where I'm not solvent, if I right, I have to as long as I can remain solvent, I have to do this. You're just asking for companies to come in that don't yet have employees and therefore have no obligation, and to come in and make a new company that makes you completely defunct, right? That makes you unnecessary. And then you'll say, well, I was nice for the last few years. Well, that's great. But pragmatism is also important here, right? If a technology can help, we can, and I totally agree with Deborah that this extreme model is narrow, even on its understanding of reality, right? Like if you can't let go of your workers, but another company can choose not to hire people, then they can do the job more effectively and more cost effectively. And then what are you going to do? You're then, by time it catches up with you, maybe you're just going to go bankrupt and you won't be able to provide them severance, right? Like if you're so narrow and the only perspective you have is, can I right now be solvent, but you don't try to keep with the times and integrate new technology, then, the people that don't have that disadvantage, because again, what drives his argument, as Deborah notes, is that they already have people in their employ, and therefore they have built-in obligations. But if a new company comes that didn't yet employ people, they don't have those obligations. right? Just like the companies without unions, right? So yeah, I totally agree with Deborah that I think that part of this is just so narrow, right? It's just so pragmatically narrow. Like I understand taking this where someone says like, okay, if I'm going to if firing this person and adopting the technology will save me, you know, $1,000. Okay, maybe you should keep the guy on. But like, if adopting this technology is a way that you slowly transform your business, that should be something you're allowed to think about without the specter of a halachically informed government coming and saying you can't do that. Right? This is our interpretation of the concentric circles of tzedakah. This is like it's a very dangerous model. Yeah, Morty.
So I was wondering, I don't know if this necessarily comes into the conversation, but I understand that we established that the best that the best form of charity is giving someone a job, and that you should focus on based on your household before you focus on the outside world. But in terms of streamlining things, making things cheaper to manufacture, and being able to bring in more business, it's not happening in a vacuum. What you are doing, if to like undercut other companies, is making things cheaper, making things more available to people that weren't necessarily able to purchase these things prior. So I don't know if this I was thinking maybe this gets into the realm of tzedakah, that people that weren't necessarily able to purchase things before, even if they're not supposed to be your first priority, if you always focus on keeping the people that are already in your baseline, your household, like especially to this extreme. But like you can even make cases for other things like unions. Then you can't you don't make things available for have-nots. So does this come into the conversation of tzedakah or
so
not?
Good, right? So what I think, this is a second thing that I that I think you're 100% right. Meaning, one of the things that I think Rabbi Shon's tshuva doesn't reflect is that even if you bought most of his assumptions, namely that employing people is a form of tzedakah, and that the concentric circle model of tzedakah means you owe more to your employees, and maybe even you accept some of his coercive arguments, maybe. He's presenting it as 100-0, right? Like, if I have more of an obligation to my employees, then I don't have to think about anything else. But that's not necessarily a good model, right? Maybe you have to recognize you have unique obligations to your employees, but as Morty notes, maybe if I can make my business more effective, and I don't know, I'm selling whatever I'm selling, right? But by making my business more effective, I can provide basic staples to more poor people, right, who are actually starving, and I can lower the prices. I don't know, take that, let's take an extreme case. So it's true that I owe more to my employees than I do to a random person. But does that mean that taking into account the effect that I can have in society and maybe the charitable implications of that, broadly speaking, is irrelevant, right? I don't think so. And, I gave the example of someone who has $100,000, in its tzedakah. So, in his tzedakah fund. So should he give that to his employees or give it to his, Tomchei Shabbos? Now, okay, on the one hand, you'd say, well, you have more obligations to your employees. But if every person who owned a small business, made that decision and therefore didn't have any extra cash to donate to the charitable organization, the educational institutions, the shuls, anything in our, and they gave designated all of their money to just fund, to less than maximal companies, society would collapse, right? Like it has to be that even if you buy his assumptions, this like black and white, like here's the maximal way, and therefore you should direct all your funds in this direction, and you must do it, and you have no choice, and you can't make other calculations. You can't take pragmatic things into effect, like Deborah notes, what might happen tomorrow. You can't take, a broader perspective where you're balancing your obligations to your employees with other things, and the only thing is, will I be solvent or not? Like, you're missing a lot, and that's where, again, I think it's important to read Rabbi Shon's tshuva, because it shows you how seriously a significant Torah scholar took this idea of obligations to your employees. Okay, but if you actually take it to its conclusion, then you would never adopt any technology or any strategy that could make society better by making things cheaper, by making you more effective. So at least me personally, I find myself much more comfortable in the let's say Rabbi Dr. Meir camp, which is you should recognize that this is a value, and it should be part of the way you think about things when you're adopting new technologies that can replace people, and you don't have to necessarily go to maximum efficiency right away, right? You can decide to ease in technology and have a little bit of wiggle room and not fire people the second they aren't absolutely necessary. Okay, that's a conversation I think worth having. But to take it to the other extreme, and now you're banned from firing people unless it threatens your solvency. And therefore you shouldn't think about introducing technologies like that already strikes me as myopic in just the pragmatic implications, the broader societal implications. But I still think it's important to quote this tshuva to just see how seriously someone takes it and how real they think these obligations are to your employees, because even if you don't go to his extent, which I'm not inclined to, it does make you think about the fact that, yeah, our only obligation is not just to adopt technology or whatever that will make you as efficient as possible. Okay, I do want to introduce another element here, which is at some point, and this is, and this really comes back to Deborah's point, at some point, if society is going to move along and companies are going to emerge, somebody is going to be let go. Right? This is going to happen. And I mentioned this already yesterday, but this is what Joseph Schumpeter referred to as creative destruction. Right? There is this idea that in order to create and to move society forward, there is going to be costs, right? People get hurt along the way. It's just a reality, right? Like, no one is going to say that we shouldn't have invented cars because there were people at the beginning of the invention of cars who were the equivalent of modern taxi drivers, but with horse and buggy, and now they're out of a job, right? If you said this every time you tried to introduce a technology, we wouldn't get anywhere. But the question is, okay, but what can we do about it? So as Rabbi Shon gave actually one answer, which is that even if you are going to let people go, maybe you should help them get another job or provide a pension, right? So there is the answer in this, that maybe employers, even when they let people go, should think about the possibility of, let's say, retraining. That they should, that we should provide retraining or enough of, a severance package that they should have time to look for work, something like that. Okay. But the reality is that if AI goes in the direction that we think it is, that may not be enough, right? If the more maximalist views of what will happen in the future happen, then there's going to be a lot of people who are out of work. There's going to be a lot of people who need to retrain. And a single employer can't do that. So is there a language to say that society has to step in to ease the pain of the creative destruction? And here, just to give a potential religious language, this was, Lisa said yesterday that this is one of the things that interests her, especially as someone trained in both Europe and America. I want to show you what she's talking about. But first, to give halachic language to it. The Rambam tells you that tzedakah isn't just a personal affair. The Rambam in 18 says, אבל תמכוי יש מקומות שנהגו בו ויש מקומות שלא נהגו בו. המנהג הפשוט היום שיהיה גבי החופה מכשיר בכל יום, etc. Says there's never been a society without a communal tzedakah organization, right? Not just individuals, but communal. Now, amazingly, until the 20th century, I found nobody who put together two things, which is one, tzedakah is communal, and two, the highest level of tzedakah is providing people with employment. To conclusion three, which is there should be communal mechanisms in place to help people be employed. But in the 20th century or late 19th, depends when he wrote it, the Aruch HaShulchan says that this is at least in line with Torah, that this is at least clearly in line with Torah values. And he writes in 19, "Uvizmanenu ze b'harbe arim yesh chavarot shnotnim na'arei anei Yisrael avalim melachot v'davar gadol hu v'davar gadol hu." Right, that there's apparently an apprentice system that they would take poor Jewish kids, they would apprentice them, and this is great, right? He says this in this context, where at least that's the combination of the notion that tzedakah is also a communal obligation, and that the highest level of tzedakah is providing employment. The notion that society should be thinking about to keep people employed when the development of technology is such that people are going to be out of work. That seems to me obvious, right? That it's at least expression of the value, right? We can think about how to do it practically, but the fact that this is an expression of the value seems to me obvious. I mean, interestingly, Rabbi Ida Reichnitz takes the Aruch HaShulchan and uses this to ground a Torah value of public education, right? He says it may not be a formal obligation, but if the way that most people get jobs is through education, and society is responsible for this highest level of tzedakah, of getting people jobs, then there's at least an expression of the value. Again, he doesn't claim it's a formal obligation, but that the ethos of the Torah might be invoked to argue that we should educate, right, and provide public education, because that gives people the ability to get employment. Rav Yosef Tzvi Rimon invoked this Aruch HaShulchan as his argument of why the tzedakah that he chose to build after the disengagement from Gush Katif was Job Katif, which was to find jobs for people from Gush Katif, right? Because so there are these hints that there's at least a Torah value in this. I see that someone is a fan of Job Katif. Yes, it's a great organization. Ramon is wonderful. But admittedly, there are other models out there, right? One model is employment and retraining. The other is straight tzedakah, but in a dignified way. And that's really the logic that has driven the push, especially in light of AI, for some form of UBI, universal basic income, right? And if you read, I didn't give you the whole book, but I gave you the reference. But Andrew Yang, who made this very famous when he ran for president for that short stint, he notes that one of the reasons he was running on UBI, right, on a platform that we should introduce universal basic income, which basically means that instead of charitable handouts, we give everybody enough money to survive so that they aren't scrounging and then can figure out what they do with their life because they at least have enough to survive, is because he's afraid of artificial intelligence and its ability to put many people out of work, right? So you have here like two sort of theories of what a serious recognition of the fact that a lot of people may be put out of work because of newer technologies, AI included, but not exclusively, and the recognition that society has a obligation for tzedakah in a way that will maintain dignity. So you have people advocating for UBI, right, which is a form of a handout, but in a way that maintains dignity. Right? It's not really a handout because you give it to everybody. And then you have, this model that maybe retraining is a kiyum, right? Helping the people who do lose their jobs find their place in the society, right? Retraining, learning how to augment their skills with those same technologies that made them lose their jobs. And what I gave you here in 22 is that there are three European economists, Philippe, I'm not going to pronounce this right, Philippe Aguillon, Celine Antonin, and Simon Bunel, in the power of creative destruction, economic upheaval, and the wealth of nations, they provide. They're economists, but they and this goes back to Lisa's point yesterday. They advocate a model that's found in certain states, including Denmark, where basically it's actually very easy to let people go, right? Because the economy, the society doesn't want to prevent people from adopting new technologies. There's very little protection of workers, but what there is generous unemployment benefits so that people have time to retrain, and generous government provided retraining, right? And that's so that you allow society to adopt new technologies. But on the flip side, when people lose their jobs for the new technologies, they have classic, let's say classic staka, enough money to not have to take a job that they're not really, that really isn't what they're qualified for. But, or to take a, let's say, a minimum wage job that they could do more, but they don't have the time to look for a job because they won't be able to put food on their plate. So you give them enough money to be able to look with peace of mind. And two is you provide retraining so that they will be reintegrated back in society. And what you see is at least echoes of the ideas of employment being part of charity, and that the community is part of the, right, is also responsible for this. I'll just read you a few lines here. They write, a first effect of creative destruction is to eliminate jobs, thereby increasing a worker's probability of becoming unemployed. This in turn is detrimental to happiness, at least in the short run, especially if unemployment entails an immediate and substantial drop in earnings in the short run and increased uncertainty about earnings in the long run. A second effect of creative destruction is to create new jobs, thereby increasing the chances of finding new employment in the future. And that's part of it, is that new technology can also create jobs. What we're really worried about is the people who lose their jobs before those new jobs are created, or aren't yet skilled in the new jobs that are created. Creative destruction creates jobs, but also new activities, new goods, and new production processes leading to better value for money for consumers. This creation side of creative destruction, which takes place mostly over the long term, tends to increase life satisfaction. Finally, a third effect, also long term, involves the fact that innovation by creative destruction generates growth and as a consequence improves future earning prospects. This theoretical reasoning gives rise to at least 4 predictions that can be empirically tested. On the one hand, creative destruction increases stress or anxiety, largely because it heightens the chance that an individual will experience unemployment. On the other hand, creative destruction implies growth and the creation of jobs, which has a positive effect on life satisfaction. The negative impact predominates in the short run, and the positive impact is more visible over the longer term. Finally, the effect of creative destruction on satisfaction is on the whole more positive when unemployment benefits are more generous. And this leads them to endorse a form of the insurer state. They write, today, flex security, the most recent step in the history of the welfare state, appears to be a logical tool to make creative destruction more humane while inducing individuals to remain active in the labor force, right? And what they're suggesting. Now, again, I'm not endorsing all of their conclusions there, right? But I think that their attempt, right, to look for models in the world where, on the one hand, you recognize that you can't just say we can't let people lose jobs, so let's not adopt technologies that are going to prevent that. On the other hand, moving society along doesn't exempt you from caring about the people who are hurt in the short run, and finding models that speak to both of those realities, right? Whether that be the classic Stucca model, which the modern version of it might be like Andrew Yang would have it as UBI, or as or the employment model like the Aruch HaShulchan. At least gives us, I think, the beginning of values that we can incorporate to think about how could we encourage the adoption of these technologies while still recognizing our ethical obligations along the way to those who are losing their jobs as part of the process, right? And I think that, again, that's what Lisa was talking about, is that in Europe, these discussions are much more explicit because they're much more open to these types of arguments, where in America, in general, people are less amenable to these arguments. And you have to figure out whether that's right? You have to figure out whether our values can inform this conversation. So that's at least, I think, the beginning of a thought process on this. Okay, reactions, questions, conversation about that. And then I don't know if we'll actually read the stuff from the last section. I didn't really plan to get it to here, but I wanted you to have it in case you wanted it. But any sort of reactions to that section? Right, to that argument. Do people find it compelling that at least, again, without drawing firm conclusions, that this is the type of language we should use thinking about it, right? Which is acknowledging communal aspects, acknowledging the practical and ethical responsibilities towards those who are left behind in the process of creative destruction, and the notion, again, that even societies have the responsibilities of tzedakah that is manifest in employment, right? Does that, at least as the beginning of a conversation, sound compelling? Again, I'm not drawing firm conclusions, right? I think that's much more complicated, as Deborah noted, right? You have to think about what this means. Sometimes, you think you're doing the right thing and you end up destroying certain companies, right? In this case, you can make entire countries not competitive, right? That's a danger. But do these values at least sound plausible, right? As a starting point for conversation. Thoughts? Morty, I see you nodding. Is that a yes? I've convinced you.
Yeah, it is a yes. I think that all the values that we brought up are all worth thinking about, and yet it's all squishy enough that we're able to deal with each individual loss of job or building up of a company and on an individual basis. I think.
Okay, good. Right. So I think squishy was a good word, right? Where I'm more comfortable at this point in the broader, right, bird's eye view, which is these values are clearly the right values we should be talking about. I'm less comfortable when you get to the hard conclusions of Rabbi Shah, right? Because this is such a broad conversation, so many potential implications. But yeah, as a squishy conversation, sure, right? I think that they're important, right? I think that they help us inform the conversation, even if they don't necessarily tell us the exact conclusion that we have to draw. Oh wait, there are chats. Did I miss a question? No, okay. Sorry, that was just from before. I hadn't opened it. Okay. Any other reactions to this before I at least tell you what's at the end of the source sheet, which we will not really read inside. Okay, so let me at least tell you what's the last sources, and then we'll have some wrap-up questions. The last section that I gave you here on pages 12 till the end are the contract issues. And I just want to sort of summarize what's going on there. There is another way of getting at this, and that is that Ramosha Feinstein comes to a conclusion that when you hire somebody, the presumption is that it's forever. And that's true even if you have a limited contract. He gets to this to a specific type of an argument. Specifically, the Shulchan Aruch, or the Ramah quotes a halakha that if someone commits to providing food for someone without an end date, the implication is forever. Right, the implication is forever. And then there's a discussion in the Nosei Kelim of the exact parameters of this law and whether it's a localized discussion to tzedakah or not. Now, the Rajba in general says that when you commit to funding someone, the implication is forever. The Rush says that no, you're only liable for a year or so. The Sma, the Pitrei Tshuva quotes the Mayim Chaim that says that the same machloket applies to employment, right? That the Rajba would tell you that when you hire someone open-ended, the implication is that you've committed to them forever. And unless something goes wrong, like they did something wrong or you can't afford it anymore, the implication is that your contract is eternal. And the Rush would say, no, the contract is as long as normal contracts are. Ramosha Feinstein argues that that's not actually true. That when it comes to employment, the presumption, according to everybody, is that unless something is wrong, you're never allowed to fire someone ever. The Chazon Ish says no. If I want to summarize the Chazon Ish as succinctly as possible, the Chazon Ish says no. When you hire someone, you hire them for the term of their contract or the norm of how long people are hired, but not forever. There's no presumption of forever. Now, this is relevant because obviously, according to Moshe Feinstein, one could go farther and not just invoke staka, but invoke contract law and say that the act of hiring someone enters you into an implicit eternal contract until such point that you actually can't employ them anymore. And if that's the case, obviously, that is going to very, very, very much limit when you can let people go, barring cases where you literally can't afford it. But again, that seems to be a very hard read that the Chazon Ish notes, right? Employment contracts seem to be based on their contract or the norm in society. That's one point. A related point is that the Pitchei Choshen, Rishaya Bloy, a leading Dayan, suggests, with no source really, that it is against halacha to let somebody go just because they've gotten too old to do their job. And building on the tzedakah and eternal contract and et cetera, et cetera. I've given you the sources inside to see whether you think that's compelling. I think it's a hard read, right? Yeah. So I mean, Deborah asks, right? Yeah. If this is the problem with Ramosha. If the term of the contract isn't a limitation, then what does that mean? Yeah. According to Ramosha, like at first glance, it's if I hire a teenage kid to mow my lawn, then he has the right to that job forever, right? Forever and ever. That just doesn't seem plausible, and that's why the Chazon Ish said that just can't be right. So I would say that I think the majority of poskim do not agree with Moshe Feinstein on this, but it is worth acknowledging that there are certain voices like Ramosha and maybe the Pitchei Choshen in the very limited circumstance of like letting someone go when they get too old, who's been with you for 30, 40 years or something like that, who think that this question of letting people go is not just a staka issue, not just a meta issue, a values issue, but is actually a contract issue. But as Deborah notes, this is a very, 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 very tough conclusion to reach. I mean, it's very hard. It's not how society runs. It seems implausible. Like I said, in the 10 minutes that we have left, or 5 minutes before wrap up, or whatever it is, I don't think we're going to have time to go through all these sources. But honestly, I wanted to mention it, and I gave you the sources that you can look at it. And in case you don't want to read all the tshuvot inside, I gave you this article that appears on the Bar Ilan Responsive Project by Rav Yosef Fleischman, where he summarizes the central issues. There are also certain discussions about how leadership issues might be different. Leadership issues may carry with them other assumptions. But again, I think the majority of folks can assume that the right categories here are not contract issues. But in case you are wondering of how one could construct an argument from that vantage point, so you can look at how Ramosha gets to a Shuva. And again, I include there the Machloket, the Rashba, the Rush, the Ramah, the Pitchei Shuva, the Mayin Chaim, and Ramosha versus the Chazon Ish, as well as Rav Bloy's discussion about whether you can let people go when they've gotten too old to work for you. And again, I've given you some sources there about why I think Rav Bloy's conclusions aren't necessarily correct. But I'm gonna leave that here so that we have a few minutes for questions before wrap up. So any questions, comments on what we discussed, what we didn't discuss? Now is the time. So.
And Rabbi Ziring, if people think of any questions after class, what's the best way they can get in touch with you?
Oh, yes. And if anyone has questions after class, as always, you have my email at the top of the source sheets, and looking around in the crowd, some of you also have my other emails and my WhatsApp, which is also fine. You are free to reach out to me that way as well. But at the very least, my email is up at the top of all the source sheets, and you are more than welcome to email me if ideas come to you in 5 minutes from now or 10 minutes from now when I'm at the wedding already and kind of answer, then I will try to respond later. Obviously not while I'm under the chuppah. That would be bad. That would be not ideal. But anyone who have any responses to this now? besides for Deborah's, response that, yeah, the Ramosha's contract issue just seems to be, just pragmatically, even without going through the sources, there has to be a limit. I agree with you. I ran this by a serious Talmud Chacham that I happened to be with, and his reaction was like, no. just no. Like, before we get to the sources, like, intuitively, that just can't be. Like, it just can't be. I mean, Ramosha was a really great posting, but like the Chazon Ish has to be right practically. Like, okay, no further thoughts on it. Okay, so maybe just give. I'll just mention just what tomorrow is. We'll give you another minute to think about it. Tomorrow will be the following, right? What we did yesterday was, can you develop and adopt these technologies that might put people out of work? Today was, okay, given that AI will put people out of work, or should employers have unique responsibilities because of staka? Does society have responsibilities maybe to retrain or to cushion the creative destruction, growing pains? And then we talked a little bit about the implicit contract issues. Tomorrow, what we're going to do is a thought experiment, which is, let's say the techno-optimists / pessimists, techno-maximalists, let's call them, are right. And AI is the final frontier, and employment becomes a thing of the past. What does that mean for us? Does halacha, does Torah, does the Agadah have a language to tell us the value of our lives when work just doesn't exist? And that's right. Is work an intrinsic good, a pragmatic good? Right? How do we think about that? And that's the question I want to deal with tomorrow, which is really where we got the title for the whole series, which was AI, a world without work. Because that is really what the techno-maximalists are suggesting, which is that we finally have reached that point, that AI is what threatens the possibility that there will be no more employment ever, or basically none. And even though I don't think that's necessarily true, and that was Lisa's point yesterday, it more likely will create new jobs and augment existing jobs. At some point, there may be a technology that makes it that is true. What do we have to say to that reality? So that's tomorrow.
All right. Well, I want to say thank you, everyone, for coming. Looking forward to seeing as many of you as possible here tomorrow. Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you, everyone. See you tomorrow.
Thank you, Rabbi.